Jackson stepped into the airlock of Station Ori 7. The metal door slid shut behind him with a soft hiss. Recycled air filled his lungs. He smelled oil and old paint. His boots clicked on the grated floor. Through a small viewport he saw the spinning asteroid belt. Tiny rocks drifted past the windows. He carried a heavy crate of rare minerals. The minerals would help rebuild a new colony on Mars. Earth needed them badly. Jackson felt both hope and worry. The station felt old but sturdy. Lights blinked in rows along the walls. The hum of power generators vibrated under his feet. He touched his comm unit. A small screen showed Lyra's name. He had booked this delivery weeks ago. Soon he would. Meet his contact. Jackson passed through a sliding door into a wide corridor. Colored tubes ran overhead. A soft blue light glowed under the panels. At a console he saw a live figure. She worked with careful hands. Her skin had a soft green hue. Long hair floated around her shoulders like seaweed. She wore a gray uniform with a small emblem. He cleared his throat. She froze and turned. Her large eyes reflected surprise. He smiled and offered a small nod. "I am Jackson Rhodes," he said. "I am Lyra," she replied. Her voice was gentle, almost musical. She stepped aside and gestured down the hall. "Please come," she said. He carried his crate behind her. They moved in silent steps. He noticed the shine of her boots. He wondered what life was like on this station for her. They reached a junction marked Cargo Bay. Lyra tapped a touchpad. The door whirred open and slid aside. Inside, rows of stacked crates glowed under harsh white lights. Jackson set his crate down gently. He watched as maintenance bots rolled past. The floor had oil stains and loose bolts. Lyra checked a small panel that read power levels. Suddenly, the lights flickered. A loud buzz filled the room. A beacon above flashed red. Lyra frowned and pressed another button. Sparks flew from a broken wire. The lights died for a moment, then returned. Jackson stepped forward. "Are you all right?" he asked. She nodded, brushing back a strand of hair. "Minor glitch," she said. "We repair it soon," he sighed. He felt the weight of uncertainty grow. They left the cargo bay and returned to the corridor. Jackson noticed a faded sign that read guest quarters. Lyra slowed and said, "Before we go further, I must tell you something." Her voice trembled slightly. Jackson stopped and looked at her. She took a deep breath and continued. "The station had a recent accident. Only one guest room is available?" He blinked in surprise. "Only one bed?" he asked softly. She nodded, her shoulders falling. "I am so sorry," she said. Jackson studied her face. He saw embarrassment in her eyes. He reached out and lightly touched her arm. "It is not your fault," he said. She gave a weak smile. He tried to imagine sharing a small room with a stranger. He felt a mix of awkwardness and curiosity. Lyra led him down a short hallway to the guest room. She swiped a key card at the door. A soft click sounded and the door opened outward. Inside, the room was small and spare. A single bed stood in one corner. The mattress looked thin. A small desk sat under a round porthole. Beyond the glass, stars and distant planets drifted. A panel on the wall displayed oxygen levels and temperature. A narrow shelf held a few personal items, a worn wrench and a tiny photo of a distant moon. The floor was clean metal. Fluorescent lights shone from recessed panels. A single chair stood next to the desk. Lyra stepped aside and said, "This is all we have." Jackson walked in and set his crate down. He looked around quietly. Jackson touched the crate's latch and felt its cold metal. He closed his eyes for a moment. He thought of his small apartment on Earth. He missed the sound of wind in the trees. Here, only the station's hum kept time. He opened his eyes and saw Lyra standing by the desk. She folded her arms and looked nervous. Jackson pulled out a datapad and began logging his delivery. Her gaze fell on his hands. He finished the log and looked at her. "I can sleep on the chair," he offered. Lyra shook her head. "You need rest," she replied. She moved the chair near the desk. He nodded and sat on the bed's edge. The thin sheet rustled under him. Lyra dimmed the lights and closed the door. A soft glow came from the porthole. They sat in silence, sharing the same small space. The silence in the small room stretched. Jackson rested against the narrow wall, staring at the porthole's faint glow. Lyra sat near the desk, her gaze fixed on the small photo of her home moon. After a moment, Jackson spoke in a soft tone. "Do you come to this room often?" he asked. Lyra looked up, surprise in her large eyes. She shook her head. "I rarely use guest space," she replied. "I usually work in the engine bay or control center." Jackson nodded, understanding her duty kept her busy. The air felt heavy but safe in their quiet company. Jackson offered her a small smile and pointed to the crate on the floor. "I have tea bags and crackers in this crate," he said. "I brought snacks for my trip." Lyra raised an eyebrow and moved closer. "Tea?" she asked. Jackson nodded and untied the crate's latch. He pulled out 2 sealed cups and a simple heater pack. Lyra watched curiously as he assembled the cup and added hot water from a small canister on the wall. The steam rose slowly. She smiled for the first time, and Jackson felt warmth beyond the drink. The room felt less cold as they sipped slowly. Lyra placed her cup down and sighed. "I grew up on this station," she said quietly. "My parents were engineers. They taught me to fix machines. But after the last meteor shower, much of the station was damaged. We lost my family's quarters." Jackson listened and felt a pang of sympathy. He touched her hand lightly. Lyra looked at him with surprise and then lowered her gaze. "I do not mean to burden you," she whispered. Jackson shook his head. "You are not alone here," he said. "We all share this place, and we help one another." Jackson closed his eyes and leaned back. "I once had a small home near a forest on Earth," he said. "I spent mornings listening to birds. I miss those days." Lyra watched his expression. She smiled softly. "The stars are beautiful here," she said. "But I imagine your forest sounds more alive." Jackson opened his eyes and looked at her. "Maybe one day I can bring you to Earth," he said. Lyra's eyes widened. She shook her head. "I have never left this station," she admitted. Jackson sighed. "We will change that." Outside, lights flickered again. Jackson heard the station's alarm echo through the door's vents. He stood and moved to the panel. Lyra joined him and pressed a button to silence the hush. A quick green light blinked. "Repair crew is on the move," she said. Jackson felt relief. He picked up his crate. "Shall we go to the cargo bay?" he asked. Lyra nodded and guided him toward the door. Jackson looked at their small space, then reached for the handle. Together they stepped into the corridor for the next task. The corridor lights hummed as they moved. Tubes overhead glowed in soft blue. Jackson carried his crate carefully. Lyra walked beside him, her steps quiet on the metal floor. A panel door to the control center stood open. Sparks from a broken conduit sparked near the ceiling. Jackson paused. Lyra pressed a switch and the sparks stopped. She smiled. They continued. Walking, passing stacks of unknown cargo. The station trembled slightly. Jackson steadied himself against the wall. Lyra placed a hand on his shoulder. "This station has seen much," she said. Jackson nodded. "But we keep it alive." They reached the control center doors and Lyra entered her access code. The doors slid aside to reveal a dim room lined with monitors and switches. One screen flickered with error codes. Jackson set the crate down and watched the display. "Power distribution is unstable," Lyra said, checking a module. She removed a small panel and showed frayed wires. Jackson knelt and offered his toolkit. Together they secured the wires and tightened loose screws. Sparks no longer flew. The monitor steadied. Lyra breathed a sigh of relief. Jackson smiled. "Great work," he said. She nodded, proud of their teamwork. With the feed restored, Lyra accessed the station logs on one monitor. She reviewed the schedule and saw Jackson's delivery slot. "Your minerals will load in 10 minutes," she said. Jackson studied her face. "Thank you," he replied softly. Lyra closed the console and led him back through the corridor. The station lights glowed steady. As they walked, Lyra looked out at the stars. Jackson carried his crate again. They reached The cargo bay. Robots moved quietly and a loader robot waited to take their crate. Lyra placed a hand on his arm. "Dinner later?" she asked. Jackson nodded. "I'll find you." Lyra watched Jackson leave and she felt a spark of hope. She looked forward to sharing that simple meal together. Jackson waited in the dimly lit mess hall, holding 2 trays. The room smelled of recycled air and simple food paste. Metal tables and chairs lined the walls. He saw Lyra enter, her steps. Quiet on the grated floor, she carried a small datapad. When she noticed him, her eyes lit with a gentle smile. He nodded and motioned to an empty table by the porthole. They sat and placed their trays down. On each tray was a warm loaf of nutrient, bread and a side of protein paste. It was not much, but it would fill them both. They ate. Lyra tapped her datapad and showed Jackson the station schematics. "I want your opinion," she said softly. "We plan to upgrade the life support system next cycle. You delivered minerals for that project." Jackson leaned forward, studying the diagrams. The layout was simple: pipes, filters, and vents snaked through. The station's core, he pointed to a pressure valve. "This section here might need a stronger seal," he said. Lyra nodded, impressed by his sharp eye. "I never noticed that," she admitted. Jackson smiled. "Sometimes an outside view helps." After a few bites, Lyra paused and looked at Jackson. "Why did you choose this station?" she asked. Jackson set down his tray. He stared out at the dark expanse beyond the window, where distant stars glimmered. "I wanted to make a difference," he said. "Earth is crowded. I joined the trader fleet to help build new homes. When I heard about Ori 7's needs, I volunteered." Lyra listened. She traced a finger along the table's edge. "You are kind," she said. Jackson shrugged. "I learned that from my family. We always shared what we could." A soft vibration shook the table. The station's warning light flashed outside the mess hall door. Lyra stood quickly. "What now?" Jackson asked, rising beside her. She checked her datapad and frowned. "An unmanned shuttle is approaching too fast," she said. They hurried to the door and joined a small group of workers. The shuttle's warning beacon pulsed red on the corridor's monitor. Lyra tapped her comm unit. "Control, this is Lyra. Identify shuttle." Her voice sounded calm but urgent. Jackson watched as robotic arms on the station's hull extended. The shuttle drew closer, its thrusters sparking. A loud clang echoed through the corridor. Jackson gripped Lyra's shoulder. "Be careful," he whispered. She nodded and ran down a side hallway. Jackson followed. They reached the external airlock. Through the viewport, they saw the shuttle's metal hull scrape against the station's docking clamp. Sparks flew into space. The arms whirred and held. The shuttle in place, Lyra punched in a code. The airlock door slid open. Inside the airlock chamber, 2 small bots floated and attached to the shuttle's hull. One bot scanned the shuttle's exterior while the other applied coolant to the hot thrusters. Lyra activated the chamber lights. Jackson felt the cold air. He floated briefly and caught himself on a support rail. Outside the viewport, space dust drifted. Lyra's voice crackled in his ear. "The shuttle's autopilot glitched. It will correct course soon." Jackson exhaled in relief. The bots finished their work and retracted. Lyra pressed a button, sealing the outer hatch. The airlock filled with air again. Jackson and Lyra stepped back into the corridor. Their suits hissed as the pressure equalized. Jackson handed his used tray to a passing worker. He looked at Lyra. "You saved the shuttle," he said. She shook her head. "We all did our part," he offered her a small grin. "Teamwork." They walked back to the mess hall. The station's normal hum returned. Jackson led Lyra to their table. She sat down and took a deep breath. "I did not expect that," she said, smiling weakly. Jackson sat opposite her. "Adventure finds us," he replied. They shared a quiet laugh. The warmth of the bread and running power felt comforting after the sudden scare. Later, as they finished their meal, Lyra tapped her datapad again. "The minerals you brought are stored now," she said. "The next phase of repairs starts tomorrow," Jackson nodded. "I will help where I can." Lyra looked at him thoughtfully. Would you like a tour of the engine bay? She asked. Jackson's heart lifted. I would, he said. She stood and offered him her hand. He accepted and rose. They left the mess hall together. The corridor lights glowed in cool white. Lyra led him past storage modules and repair bays. She showed him old engine parts mounted as trophies on the wall. Jackson ran his hand along a polished turbine blade. These are from early missions, Lyra explained. This station grew from small beginnings. Jackson's respect for the station deepened. He saw the pride in Lyra's stance. They reached a heavy door labeled Engine Bay. Lyra punched in her code and the door slid open. Inside, the room was warm and smelled of oil. Giant machines hummed and pistons moved in rhythm. Technicians in jumpsuits worked on engines suspended from overhead rails. Jackson watched a technician replace a worn gear. Lyra approached and offered a tool. The technician nodded and smiled. Thanks, Lyra, he said. Lyra turned to Jackson. This is my home, she said softly. Jackson looked around. It feels alive, he replied. Lyra's eyes shone. Jackson realized that this place, once strange, was becoming familiar because of her dot. As they walked through the engine bay, Jackson felt a new sense of belonging. Lyra pointed out a control panel set into the wall. This manages power flow, she said. I hope to improve its efficiency. Jackson studied the switches and lights. I have ideas, he said. Lyra smiled warmly. Side by side, they moved toward the heart of the station, ready to face whatever came next together. JXO, and watched as Lyra guided him deeper into the engine bay. Massive pipes coiled along the ceiling, and the low hum of turbines filled the air. Technicians moved with purpose, tightening bolts and monitoring gauges. Lyra pointed to a cluster of glowing vents. This section diverts excess heat, she explained. I want to add a secondary coolant loop here. Jackson knelt beside the pipes and traced a path with his finger. If we reroute part of this flow through the spare manifold, it will reduce pressure, he said. Lyra's eyes brightened. Together they marked the new route on a small datapad and alerted the lead engineer, who approved their plan. They spent the next hour working side by side. Lyra handed Jackson tools with precision, and Jackson passed her components for the new loop. They attached a thin coil of tubing and sealed it with clamps. Sparks flew when Lyra tightened a clamp too hard, but she laughed and wiped her brow. Jackson smiled at her easy confidence. The glow of the heat vents dimmed as coolant circulated through the new loop. Gauges steadied and lights on the control panel turned green. Lyra pumped her fist in quiet triumph. It works, she said softly. Jackson nodded, proud of their teamwork. After the repair, Lyra led Jackson back toward the corridor. Their footsteps echoed on the metal floor. Overhead lights shifted from white to soft amber, signaling evening on the station's cycle. Lyra glanced at Jackson and asked, Would you like to see the observation deck? Jackson hesitated. He had not expected another invitation, but he welcomed it. They took a service elevator up 2 levels. The doors opened onto a narrow walkway lined with reinforced glass. Beyond, the vastness of space stretched out, dusted with distant stars and the pale blue of a nearby planet. JXON pressed his hand against the glass. He felt a cool breeze from the air vents, carrying the faint scent of ozone. Lyra stood beside him, her green skin illuminated by starlight. People come here to remember home, she said. Jackson looked at her. It reminds me why I travel. So far, he replied. They watched a meteor shower sweep across the darkness. Lyra reached for Jackson's hand. He felt her fingers curl around his own. They stood in silence, sharing the quiet wonder of the cosmos. In that moment, the station's problems felt small. Suddenly, a distant rumble vibrated through the walkway. The lights flickered and alarms sounded in the corridor behind them. Lyra's grip tightened. What now? Jackson whispered. They hurried back to the elevator, which shook as it descended. When the doors opened, they saw a group of engineering drones moving erratically, sparks flying from their joints. A large coolant valve in the corridor had burst, and steam hissed around the broken pipe. Technicians shouted warnings and backed away. Lyra stepped forward and raised her voice. "Clear the area," she called. Jackson joined her in guiding the crew to safety. With most people out of harm's way, Lyra and Jackson assessed the damage. The valve had detached from its mount and coolant sprayed in a fine mist. Jackson knelt and examined the fracture. "This fitting cracked under pressure," he said. Lyra checked her datapad. "It was scheduled for replacement tomorrow," she said. "But this happened early." They worked quickly. Jackson handed Lyra a spare valve, and she fitted into place while he held the pipe steady. Metal hissed and clanged, but together they tightened the new part. Lyra activated her comm unit and directed a nearby maintenance robot to recharge. The line dot as the steam cleared, the corridor's lights returned to steady glow. The drones resumed their tasks under careful supervision. Jackson straightened and brushed his hands on his pants. Lyra looked at him with relief. "Thank you," she said. "I could not have done this alone." Jackson shook his head. "We make a good team," he replied. Lyra smiled warmly, and for a moment the tension melted away. That night, Jackson returned to the guest room, his crate empty and his mind buzzing. He found Lyra waiting by the porthole, looking at a cluster of new stars he had never seen. She turned. When he entered and gestured to the bed, "Would you like some tea before rest?" she asked. Jackson nodded and sat beside her. As she prepared 2 cups, he thought of how far he had come from Earth. Sharing this small room with Lyra no longer felt strange. It felt like belonging. They sipped their tea and watched the silent beauty of space, ready for whatever Part 5 would bring. Jaxon woke early to the steady hum of station. Oris 7, he slid off the narrow bed and stepped onto the cool metal floor. The hatch hissed open and he peered into the silent corridor. Soft glow panels lit his path. The air smelled faintly of coolant and breakfast paste. He tapped his comm unit. "Lyra?" he murmured. No answer came. Concern stirred in his chest. He decided to find her. He followed the main passage, passing quiet maintenance drones and sealed cabins. The station felt alive beneath his boots. Ready for whatever the day would bring, he reached the communication hub and found Lyra at the console, her soft grey skin glowed under pale screens. She looked up as he entered. "I see a vessel approaching," she said in a calm voice. Jackson moved beside her and peered at the display. A small blip drifted toward the station's docking rings. Lyra tapped. "A few controls. It is not in our registry," she added. Jackson frowned. "Shall we hail them?" he asked. She nodded and pressed the call button. A soft tone chimed, then a voice crackled through the speaker. "This is Captain Harper of the Mercury Dawn," the voice said. "We request docking for repairs." "Our hull took damage in the belt." Lyra exchanged a look with Jackson. "We can offer Bay 3, she replied. Jackson studied the approach vector on his screen. "We should slow their speed by 10%. He suggested. Lyra adjusted the controls. The vessel's projected path shifted to a gentle glide. Jackson felt relief. They had a chance to help without risking the station's safety. They hurried to the docking control room. The door slid open onto panels and levers. Jackson and Lyra moved to the manual override station. Lyra entered her code and the clamps unwound. The airlock cycled and doors sealed in a hiss. They stood together in the small control cubicle as the shuttle glided into place. Outside the viewport, sparks flew where the hull scraped against the ring. Jackson reached for Lyra's hand and gave it a quick squeeze. She smiled, her eyes shining with cautious hope. In the docking chamber, steam hissed from a cracked coolant line on the shuttle's side. Lyra and Jackson floated in light suits as they waited near the hatch. It opened with a soft click. Captain Harper stepped through, guided by 2 crew members. One held a small child who blinked at the unfamiliar sight. Lyra offered a warm nod. "Welcome to Ori 7, she said. Harper's face relaxed into a tired smile. They led the newcomers into a decontamination bay and guided them to remove their suits safely. Harper explained that their shuttle carried refugees from a collapsed mining colony. Many families had no home or aid. Lyra's expression softened. She motioned to a nearby medical station. We have supplies and shelter, she told them. Jackson fetched 2 cups of warm broth and offered one to the child. The girl drank, then gave a small smile. Around them, crew volunteers set up cots and distributed blankets. Jackson and Lyra worked side by side, carrying baskets of fresh rations and water packs. Once the families were settled in the guest wing, Jackson and Lyra guided them to the mess hall. Long tables held loaves of hearty nutrient bread and fresh paste. Dishes, refugees and crew mingled as volunteers served warm meals. Laughter rose softly. Lyra stood beside Jackson and watched as strangers shared food and stories. They look more at ease, she said quietly. Jackson nodded, his heart light. Helping each other is what keeps this station alive, he replied. Lyra smiled and touched his arm, thankful for the moment. After dinner, Jackson invited Lyra to walk with him to the observation deck. They rode the service elevator up 2 levels. The doors opened onto a glass-lined walkway. The vast black of space stretched before them, speckled with distant stars and the curve of a blue planet. They leaned on the railing side by side. Jackson whispered, "I never thought today would end this way." Lyra replied, "We did the right thing." They held hands and watched as the Mercury Dawn drifted away for repairs under station escort. Later, back in the guest room, Jackson set down his empty toolkit. Lyra dimmed the overhead lights to a soft blue glow. They sat on the single bed, sharing the thin blanket. The room was small but felt safe now. Jackson picked up a worn photo of Lyra's home moon from the shelf. She took it gently and traced its edge. "Thank you for today," she said softly. Jackson reached for her hand. "Thank you for letting me help," he replied. They lay back, listening to the hum of life support as the first light of station morning crept in. In that quiet hour, both felt a new bond. The day had brought challenge, fear, and warm kindness. They knew tomorrow would bring fresh tasks, but for now their hearts rested. Ori 7 spun silently in its orbit, carrying hope and human friendship among the stars. JXO woke with a start to the sharp alarm tone echoing through the guest room. The thin mattress rustled as he rose and rushed to the door. The corridor lights outside glowed red. He tapped his comm unit. "Lyra, what is happening?" he whispered urgently. A moment later, her gentle voice crackled back. "Asteroid fragments are headed this way," she said. "We need to get to the command center now." Jackson grabbed his jacket and sprinted. Down the metal hall, the hum of power generators roaring in his ears. As Jackson turned the corner, he almost collided with Lyra. Her uniform was dusted with coolant mist. Her eyes shone with resolve. She led him through a narrow service tunnel, tubes and cables overhead. Sparks flew from a loose conduit, but Lyra waved him past without fear. Jackson's chest tightened with anxiety, but he trusted her silently. The tunnel opened into the command center, where rows of consoles and flickering monitors stared back at them like metal eyes. Inside the command center, technicians and officers worked in tense silence. A large screen at the front showed jagged shapes racing toward the station. Lyra moved quickly to a nearby console and tapped commands. "We must raise the deflector shields," she said, her voice calm. Jackson joined her and studied the power. Grid display. Red lines pulsed where energy was low. He pointed to a broken circuit indicator. "This line is damaged," he said. "I can repair it if you reroute power from the secondary generator." Lyra nodded and entered a code on her datapad. Heavy machinery hummed in the depths of the station as backup power came online. Jackson slipped on a utility belt filled with tools. Lyra pressed a button on the console. The command center doors slid open with a pneumatic hiss. Together they strode into the maintenance corridor where the air thrummed with raw energy. The station shook as the first fragments tapped its outer hull. The corridor led to the shield generator room. Massive pipes and cables ran like veins. Along the walls, Jackson and Lyra stopped before a heavy hatch. Lyra placed her hand on the biometric scanner. The hatch slid open into a cavernous chamber lit by the generator's soft green glow. The heart of the station pulsed before them. A fine mist of coolant drifted through the air. Jackson inhaled deeply and stepped forward to locate the damaged circuit. The circuit board lay cracked, sparks dancing along its edge. Jackson knelt and examined the fractures. Lyra floated beside him, reading her datapad. "I will initiate the shield sequence as soon as you fix the line," she said. Jackson worked swiftly, replacing a scorched conduit and tightening connections. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. Finally, he snapped the last clamp into place. The sparks vanished. Jackson stood and Lyra pressed the launch button on a nearby panel. The generator roared to life. Beams of blue energy arced along conduits overhead. Jackson and Lyra ducked as a warning klaxon sounded. Outside the reinforced viewport, glowing lines formed a shimmering dome around the station. The deflector shields rose just as the first asteroid. Fragments struck, a shower of sparks danced against the glass. The impact rattled the entire structure, but the shields held strong. Jackson exhaled, his heart pounding. The station rocked again as smaller fragments hammered the hull. Lyra gripped Jackson's arm. "We did it," she whispered. He nodded, relief washing over him. The alarms faded to a low hum. Lights returned to their steady glow. Technicians cheered and clapped as energy grids stabilized. Jackson looked at Lyra's face, smeared with grease and joy. In that moment, the fear of the storm melted away in the warmth of their shared triumph. Later, the corridors were calm. Jackson and Lyra walked back to the guest quarters side by side. The station's soft hum felt comforting now. They paused at the door to the small room. Lyra pushed it open and flicked on the lights, bathing the space in gentle white. Jackson entered and set down his toolkit. The bed looked inviting after the chaos. Lyra closed the door and leaned against it, her green eyes reflecting fatigue and pride. Jackson sat on the bed and patted the mattress. "I will never forget today," he said softly. Lyra joined him and settled beside him, leaving a small space between them. She smiled tiredly. "You kept me calm," she replied. Jackson reached out and brushed a stray lock of hair from her forehead. They sat in silence, listening to the steady hum of life support. Outside the porthole, distant stars shimmered peacefully. In that quiet moment, both felt a deeper bond. The crisis had tested them, and they had faced it together. Jackson picked up a small photo of Lyra's home moon from the shelf and handed it to her. She held it gently. "One day you will see it," he promised. Lyra nodded. They shared a quiet laugh, full of hope for what tomorrow might bring. In the small room with one bed, two friends found strength and trust under the silent watch of the stars. Jackson woke to the gentle hum of the station's life support. He stretched and looked at Lyra, who lay curled against the thin blanket. Morning. Light glowed softly through the porthole. He rose quietly so as not to wake her and stepped into the corridor where cool air drifted past. Today was the day he would leave Ori 7. He felt a knot of sadness tighten in his chest. Down the hall, Lyra was already at the cargo bay, checking the storage logs. Jackson carried his remaining supplies and placed them beside the other crates. As he entered, Lyra looked up and smiled, though her eyes held a hint of sorrow. "Good morning," he whispered. She nodded and tapped her datapad. "Your shuttle arrives in an hour," she said. Jackson glanced at the viewport. Beyond, the freighter waited in silent orbit. "I will miss this place," he admitted. Lyra's smile faltered. She closed her datapad and stepped closer. "You help more than you know," she replied. They spent the next moments together as the delivery bots rolled in. Jackson guided his last crate onto the platform while Lyra oversaw the automatic loader. Sparks of routine and chance had woven them into a team. Finally, the bay doors slid open to space, and the freighter's docking clamps extended. Jackson tested. A data cable for communication. Everything was ready. He turned to Lyra, who watched him with thoughtful calm. "Thank you for everything," he said softly. Lyra's green skin seemed to glow in the bay's lights. She hesitated, then stepped forward. From under her uniform she produced a small object wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said. Jackson accepted the parcel. Inside was a tiny model of an asteroid, carved from the very minerals he had delivered in Part 1. Its surface was rough, but shining where Lyra's tools had polished it. He held it gently. It is beautiful, he whispered. Lyra watched him closely. So you remember Ori 7? She said. A chime sounded. The freighter's gunners activated their thrusters for departure. Jackson and Lyra walked to the airlock together. Inside, they donned light suits. Lyra's hand brushed against Jackson's as she secured her helmet. He caught her hand and held it for a moment. Come to Earth, he said. Her thumbs lingered in the seam of his glove. I will, she promised. The airlock door slid open, and the station's hull floated past. Jackson stepped into the small craft, his boots clicking on the surface. Lyra followed and placed the carved asteroid in a compartment. She straightened and looked back at the station. Jackson joined her at the viewport. Below them, Ori 7 spun like a lantern in the darkness, its lights glittering across the metal surface. Lyra's breath fogged the glass. Jackson placed his hand against the cold. I will never forget this, he said. Lyra nodded. Tears pooled in her eyes. She turned away, her composure wavering. Jackson gently tilted her helmet back so he could see her face. You are brave and kind, he said. She blinked and smiled softly, wiping a tear away. And you are strong, Jackson, she replied. They shared a quiet moment before the pilot called from the cockpit. We're ready, his voice crackled over the suit. Come. JXON squeezed Lyra's shoulder. I'll see you soon, he said. She offered a small laugh that sounded like music. I'll be waiting, she replied. Jackson opened the inner hatch and stepped through. The pilot guided him to his seat. Lyra stood at the viewport until he was strapped in. Then she turned and walked back toward the airlock door. Jackson reached for his cum unit. Goodbye, Lyra, he said, voice thick with feeling. Goodbye, Jackson, she answered. The hatch closed between them. Jackson exhaled and tried to calm his heart. The freighter's engines rumbled and the glass trembled. Outside, space rushed past as they slowly moved away from Ori 7 through the viewport. Jackson watched the station fade into a bright point. Back on Ori 7, Lyra stood alone in the airlock chamber. She pressed her hand against the metal wall where Jackson had stood. The carved asteroid lay on a console beside her. She picked it up and cradled it gently. The weight of memory and hope filled her. She turned and walked down the corridor toward the guest quarters they had shared. Inside the small room, she placed the model asteroid on the narrow shelf next to her worn wrench and the photo of her home moon. In the silence that followed Jackson's departure, Lyra felt both loss and promise. She looked at the single bed and thought of the stranger who had become her friend. Outside the porthole, the stars continued their endless dance. She whispered into the quiet, Thank you, Jackson. With a deep breath, she set the carved asteroid down and began her day's work, carrying his gift of hope into every task. Meanwhile, aboard the freighter, Jackson held the carved asteroid in his gloved hand. He placed it carefully in his satchel. He leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes, imagining the shine of Ori 7's corridors and the hum of turbines. He spoke softly to the stars, I'll be back. The ship's engines flared, and Jackson watched the station grow smaller. In that shared silence, two hearts turned toward the future, one preparing for life on Earth, the other keeping the lights alive on Ori 7. Though they were apart, their memories and promises stretched across the emptiness of space, binding them until they would meet again. Ask ChatGPT.